Yeah, I'll kick off. It's an absolute pleasure to be introducing Professor Joanna Moncrieff again to another AD4E event. She spoke at, I think it was our 4th event. It seems like, well, it is years ago, but yeah, seems like a different life in some ways. Back in, I think it was 2017 in London, and since then we've wanted her back ever since. So thank you so much, Joanna, for being here. Just going to read Joanna's bio. So Joanna Moncrieff is Professor of Critical and Social Psychiatry at the University College London and a consultant psychiatrist at North East London Foundation Trust. She's one of the founders and co-chairs of the Critical Psychiatry Network. Her research consists principally of a critique of mainstream views around psychiatric drugs. She also writes about the history of drug treatment and about the history, politics and philosophy of psychiatry more generally. She's currently leading UK government-funded research on reducing and discontinuing antipsychotic drug treatment and collaborating on a study to support antidepressant discontinuation. And she's the author of numerous papers, several books, including The Bitterest Pills, The Troubling Story of Antipsychotic Drugs, and The Myth of the Chemical Cure. And obviously the book that she's talking about today that has been recently significantly updated from its original incarnation. I can't waive it because, as with all good books, I've lent it to someone, which is disappointing to me because I like to give a book a wave on these events. Anyway, hopefully somebody's got the book to wave. It's a straight talking introduction to psychiatric drugs, the truth about how they work and how to come off them. And without doubt, the most useful, accessible, and indeed the most straight talking, as the name suggests, book that I've ever read on the subject. And if you haven't read it, I do recommend highly that you take advantage of the discount code that PCCS Books have kindly given us for this event today. We'll get the details on the chat, and we'll also send those details out via Eventbrite after the event. So enjoy the presentation. Joanna, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thanks, Jo. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. I haven't got it with me either. It's upstairs, so I can't wave it, but it's in my slides, which I will now share. If it's working. Okay, no. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
That's coming up just perfectly, Joanna. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. So yeah. So I thought that today I'd try and get across the main messages of the book, but also I really want to try and emphasize what I learned while I was writing it, while I was updating it. And the main thing that I learned when I was updating it is how much we don't know about psychiatric drugs. And that, I think, should really worry us. So the main message is that I do believe that some psychiatric drugs can be useful in some limited situations, but the concern that I've been putting across for many years now is that we fundamentally misunderstand what they do, and they are undoubtedly prescribed to far too many people for much too long. 17% of the English population are now taking an antidepressant. 8% are taking a benzodiazepine, and that is despite big efforts to try and reduce benzodiazepine prescribing, and rates of prescribing of other psychiatric drugs like antipsychotics and stimulants have also been going up over recent years. And what I think many people who are taking these drugs do not appreciate, or did not appreciate maybe, is that these drugs are what we could call psychoactive substances. That means substances that change the normal state of the brain. And moreover, they change it in ways that we do not fully understand. And these changes result in changes in mental activity, behavior, and physical functioning as well. And what's more, some of these changes are harmful and may persist after the drugs have been stopped. So we've known actually for a long time, since the 1960s, that if you take antipsychotics for a significant period of time, you can get this side effect called tardive dyskinesia, which is abnormal movements, but also some cognitive impairment it's associated with. We've also known, at least since the late 1980s and early 1990s, that some people who try and stop benzodiazepines will get persistent adverse effects even after they've stopped the medication, sometimes lasting for many months and possibly longer than that. So we've had evidence for quite a long time that that psychiatric drugs can cause adverse changes that persist when they are stopped. In other words, that some of them are causing lasting damage to the brain. Now, this is the misconception that the widespread use of psychiatric drugs is based on. And this is the idea that these drugs work by correcting an underlying biological abnormality, that they have a normalizing effect. Normally, that biological abnormality is referred to as a chemical imbalance, but sometimes other theories are put forward, like there's an abnormality of neural circuitry that somehow the drugs can adjust. And I'm sure you're aware this idea has been widely promoted by the pharmaceutical industry. This is an advert for an antipsychotic showing a woman in a very balanced position here, just to emphasize it. And this view of what psychiatric drugs are doing is what I've called the disease-centered model of drug action. That's the idea that their therapeutic effects arise from the drug's effect on biological mechanisms that produce the symptoms of diseases or disorders. And this is a model that is borrowed from general medicine, where most drugs do work in that way. They may not be reversing the underlying cause of the disorder, but they work on the biological mechanisms that produce symptoms. For example, when you use your asthma inhaler, it's not curing the cause of asthma, but it works on the mechanisms that produce airways constriction. It counteracts those and relaxes your airways and therefore reduces your breathlessness. Now, there's an alternative way of understanding what psychiatric drugs might be doing when people take them for mental health problems. And that's what I've called the drug-centered model of drug action. And this is, I believe, the correct way to understand what they're doing. And this stresses that drugs, far from reversing an underlying abnormality, are creating an abnormal or altered brain state. And that if and when they have useful consequences, or consequences that are perceived by some people to be useful, it's a consequence of these changes to the normal functioning and activity of the brain. And an example might be the use of alcohol for social anxiety. We know that alcohol changes the brain, and that this is manifested in changes in behavior, and these changes include signs of social disinhibition. And when these are superimposed onto someone who suffers from social anxiety, then the anxiety will be reduced and they will appear to be better. So this is a model that emphasizes, as I said before, that the drugs that we use are psychoactive substances. That is, substances that change the normal state of the brain, and by doing so change our normal mental states, our normal abilities to think and feel, and therefore the way that we behave. There are linked physical alterations. They also affect various parts of the body. And although we often think of psychoactive drugs, we talk of psychoactive drugs when we're talking of recreational drugs, drugs that change the brain and change mental states may produce changes that are pleasant for most people, and then those drugs can become recreationally used drugs, but they may also change the brain in ways that are experienced as unpleasant, sometimes as highly unpleasant, like most antipsychotics are experienced to be. So psychoactive drugs may cause euphoria, make people feel nice and good, but they may also cause euphoria or be really unpleasant to take. They also have another property that I think is really important to appreciate, and this was summed up really well by Peter Breggin in his phrase spellbinding. He talks about the spellbinding effects of psychoactive drugs, and this is the idea that when we're under their influence, they impair our ability to evaluate our own performance or experience. So it's easy for people to fool themselves that the drugs are helping them when in fact they're not helping them. We know this, we can illustrate this most clearly with the effects of alcohol on driving. The reason we have drink driving laws is we recognize that when people are under the influence of alcohol, they are not good at judging their own abilities and may jump in a car and think they're the best driver in the world when in fact their driving is objectively impaired. So, a bit of background and history. People have used psychoactive substances to alleviate misery and unhappiness for millennia. Most commonly alcohol. This is Hogarth's print of Gin Lane. Gin became very popular when people moved to the cities from the countryside in the 18th century and were living in really impoverished conditions. Something else that was popular in the 19th century was a mixture of alcohol and opium known as laudanum. And this was widely used, again, often to alleviate misery and difficult circumstances, and also widely used for pain. My favorite one of these is Vin Mariani, which was developed by a Portuguese chemist and widely advertised for nervous depression and general malaise. And it consisted of a mixture of Bordeaux wine and cocaine. And it was endorsed, it was so thought to be so fantastic, it was endorsed by Pope Leo II or III and awarded the Vatican Gold Medal. This general use of psychoactive substances to help get by get by everyday life in circumstances that were generally much more difficult than our own in the 21st century came to an end at the beginning of the 21st century when more and more substances were prohibited or restricted. Most famously, of course, alcohol was prohibited in the United States from the 1920s to from the 1917, I think, to the 1929. But other laws came in to restrict the availability of drugs like cocaine and opium at this time as well. And what happened basically is that the pharmaceutical industry, these are all the laws, the pharmaceutical industry stepped into the breach and started to produce psychoactive substances that could be prescribed to people as medical treatments, as the unrestricted use of psychoactive substances became more difficult. So the first drugs that were used like this were the barbiturates, which were produced from the 1910s even, but started to be widely marketed in the 1930s onwards for anxiety, depression, general distress. Then stimulants were very popular and widely advertised from the 1940s to help with fatigue and apathy, and they were widely prescribed for depression as well. If you can't be bothered to do your housework, take a stimulant. Then benzodiazepines came in the 1960s, and they were also advertised for the relief of anxiety and tension. As you notice, these are mostly advertised to women, but occasionally they were advertised to men. If you're single, you obviously need some Valium. And interestingly, we still continue to market these sorts of drugs mainly to women, and women, particularly middle-aged women, are still the main consumers of psychiatric drugs. This is an advertisement for quetiapine. Now, at this time, in the early 20th century, these drugs were still being understood broadly according to that drug-centered model that I mentioned earlier. So this is an advertisement for amphetamine. Clearly, highlighting its stimulant properties. It's going to make you smart and energetic and confident like stimulants do. This is an advertisement for barbiturates, which is clearly highlighting their sedating properties. They're highly sedating drugs and were widely used for insomnia. And when modern psychiatric drugs started to come in the 1950s, these are the drugs that we still use and prescribe, they were also understood initially according to this drug-centered model. So the first drugs that we now refer to as antipsychotics were actually initially regarded as special sorts of sedatives. And initially they were referred to by names that reflect these properties. They were called neurological inhibitors and then neuroleptics, lepsis meaning to seize or restrict. So neuroleptics meaning to restrict the nervous system. And they were also widely referred to as major tranquilizers. This is an advertisement from 1960 that clearly is highlighting their tranquilizing effects. But what happens over the course of the 50s and 60s is that these ideas change, and that this idea comes about that they're not just tranquilizing people, they're targeting the underlying disease in some way. These are quotes, this is a quote from the primary English, British textbook of psychiatry of the period. They're doing more than just tranquilizing. And by the time you get to 1970, they are being spoken of as drugs that are able to target specifically psychotic symptoms and by implication, the underlying cause of psychosis. And they start to be referred to as antipsychotics. And a similar process happens with antidepressants as well. Some early antidepressants are stimulants, and then they start to get distinguished from stimulants and spoken about as drugs that have specific effects on depression. So what happens over the course of the 1950s and 60s is you get this change from a drug-centered to a disease-centered way of understanding psychiatric drugs. And that's perhaps best summed up in the way that drugs are named and classified. So prior to this time, drugs are broadly classified according to the sorts of alterations that they produce. So they're broadly classified into those drugs that have sedative effects and those drugs that have stimulating effects that increase arousal. From the 1950s onwards, they start to be classified and named according to the sorts of diseases, underlying diseases they are thought to treat. And this is the way that we talk about them and classify them and name them now. So we now talk about antipsychotics and antidepressants and anxiolytics, etc. And I'm not going to go into all this, but this transformation does not happen because there's accumulating evidence that drugs really have this disease-centered effect. There was and there is almost no support for that point of view, and an awful lot of support for the other drug-centered model of drug action. And what seems to happen, the main reason for this is that the main evidence that we have for the effects of psychiatric drugs consist of reams and reams of placebo-controlled trials. When you're comparing an active drug with a placebo, you can't distinguish whether the drug is having effects by changing an underlying hypothetical disease process or whether it's having effects by creating an altered state. So they don't distinguish the drug-centered and disease-centered model. And the ideas that we have about the causes of mental disorder, the neurochemical causes like the dopamine theory of schizophrenia and the serotonin theory of depression, have not, despite the widespread publicity these theories have received, have not ever been substantiated. And what seemed to happen over the course of the 1950s and 60s and 70s is that people latched onto the idea that was proposed that maybe these drugs were targeting the underlying basis of a disease, and latched onto the theories that were put forward to support this, like the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and the monoamine hypothesis of depression, and basically seemed to forget that there could be an alternative way of understanding what drugs might be doing. So what does the drug-centered model really involve then? First of all, it involves understanding the sorts of mental and behavioral alterations that drugs produce. Secondly, understanding how these might interact with the problems, or what are called the symptoms of mental health problems. And thirdly, thinking about whether this is really safe and really helpful in each particular situation. And each sort of drug that we think about has a number of different effects on the brain and the body that occur, and subsequent effects on mental activity and behavior that occur at different points when it's being taken. So drugs, when they're just taken a few times, have short-term or immediate effects. But then if you continue to take them, those effects may change and other effects may come along. And of course, when people stop taking a drug, especially if they've been taking it for a long time, then there are withdrawal-related changes, which are related to the fact that the presence of a drug that's taken continuously changes the underlying structure and activity of the body and the brain. And as I mentioned earlier, there's evidence that some effects that occur after stopping a drug may also be persistent. So just as an example, if we think about the antipsychotic, if we think about the older antipsychotics like haloperidol, we know that some of their immediate effects, at least, are caused by dopamine blockade. And there's quite a lot of research on animals and volunteers that describe what those immediate effects are and show that, as well as causing sedation, these drugs cause reduced mental and physical activity, emotional blunting, and that these effects, in the case of drugs like haloperidol, are associated with effects that are reminiscent of Parkinson's disease, muscular tension and rigidity, and slowing down of mental activity, which are features of Parkinson's disease. In the long term, it seems that these immediate effects continue, but you also can get some other effects which possibly are a consequence of the body manufacturing more dopamine receptors or increasing dopamine activity to compensate for the drug's effects. And sometimes it seems that compensation might overshoot, so that people show some effects sometimes of having hyperactive dopamine system, and this is thought to be the possibly, there are other theories, the cause of tardive dyskinesia. One of the features of heightened dopamine activity is abnormal involuntary movements, which occur in tardive dyskinesia, and it's also thought that maybe this might explain something called supersensitivity psychosis, the occurrence of psychosis when people are taking antipsychotics or after they've stopped them. We also know that antipsychotics reduce brain volume. We're not sure of the mechanism of action of that. There are withdrawal effects. Again, we're not sure about the mechanism of action, but it may be a rebound increase in dopamine and other neurotransmitters. And there are these, and there's this evidence that tardive dyskinesia can be persistent. Again, we're not clear about the mechanism of action of that. And the psychiatrists who first used these drugs back in the 1950s and 60s, they proposed themselves that these immediate effects that antipsychotics have, this slowing up of mental activity and the emotional blunting that they produce, were what was helpful in people with psychosis, were what consisted of the therapeutic effect. So Pierre Denneker talked about how patients who were given these drugs simply lost interest in their psychotic symptoms, and therefore appeared to be better than they had been. And this idea that symptoms become less intrusive, less intense when people are using antipsychotics is also cited by a lot of people who've used them more recently for psychotic problems, who also highlight that along with dampening down the psychotic symptoms, they dampen down other aspects of life and make life grayer and more and duller. And this is summarized in this very clever cartoon by someone who calls herself Anti-Psychiatry, who's contrasting that sort of grey normality produced by antipsychotics with the colourful excitement that may be associated with a psychosis, although it may be very frightening as well, of course. So, I think if you look at antipsychotics in this way, you can see that they may have some helpful effects if someone is acutely psychotic, but they're also probably quite unpleasant to take and may actually make it more difficult for people to get on with their day-to-day lives if they're taking them for long periods of time, if they're constantly sort of slowed up and sedated. And I'm doing this study, some of you will know about the radar study that Jo mentioned in her introduction, to really try and look in detail about what the long-term benefits and costs of antipsychotic treatment are by comparing people who are taking maintenance with people who have a very gradual reduction and doing a proper long-term outcome. What about antidepressants? Antidepressants, there's been much less research on what mental and physical alterations they produce in the short term, but they do seem to have this effect of, their effects are much more subtle than antipsychotics, but they do nevertheless seem to be reported to have this effect of reducing, of causing emotional numbness or reducing people's emotional reactivity, ability to experience both positive and negative emotions. And this seems to be associated, particularly for SSRIs, with their ability to cause sexual dysfunction and reduce libido, among other things. And they also frequently reported to cause lethargy, although in some people, particularly younger people, they also seem to cause agitation. Tricyclic antidepressants are chemically completely different, related to antipsychotics, very sedating, cause very obvious cognitive impairment when they're tested in volunteers. Antidepressants come from lots of different chemical classes, and they all have very different, they all cause very different alterations to normal physical and mental functioning depending on their chemical class. So the question is really, are these effects useful in depression? And the literature, the evidence suggests no, not really. The difference between an antidepressant and a placebo is really minimal and very consistently minimal across all the different meta-analyses that have been done. Adds up to just a couple of points on the Hamilton rating scale of depression. In this huge study of the treatment of depression in the United States, the antidepressant treatment of depression, which enrolled about 4,000 people and gave people really gold standard medical treatment for depression. They were given one antidepressant, and then if that didn't work, another one. They were given psychosocial support and psychological therapy as well. And in that, sorry, I don't know whether they got psychological therapy. I should take that back. They certainly got psychosocial support and frequent medication reviews. 4,000 people were enrolled. 1,500 of them got better at some point during the year of the study. Only 150 out of the 4,000 got better, stayed better, and didn't drop out. So the study results suggest that in real life, antidepressants are really pretty useless. And although I wouldn't say they have quite as worrying of adverse effects as antipsychotics, they do have significant adverse effects. There's been more and more publicity recently about the sexual impairment that they cause, not only while people are taking them, but it appears that this effect can also be persistent in some people after they've stopped taking them. And there's been more and more publicity recently about how difficult it may be to come off these drugs once people have been on them for a long period of time. So I'll just skip over this, sorry, and I just want to talk about the problems of coming off psychiatric drugs, because I cover this in the book a little bit. And what I think it's really important to realize, I'm sure many of you here will have realized it, is that when you come off a drug, when you stop a drug, that's not the same, you're not in the same state as if you had never taken it in the first place. But a lot of the research and a lot of the, psychiatric literature on this topic assumes that you are. So it assumes that when you stop a psychiatric drug, if something bad happens, that's due to your underlying problem. And that would have happened anyway, regardless of whether you'd taken or stopped this drug. But of course, we know that lots of other things happen when you stop a drug. First of all, you can get these physiological withdrawal reactions, which may include symptoms like anxiety and depression and even psychotic symptoms. There have been some studies that show that people who've stopped taking antipsychotic-like substances that are given for things like nausea sometimes develop a psychotic reaction when these are stopped suddenly, even though they've never had any history of psychosis in the past, and sometimes they're sometimes these people are quite old and have had quite a lot of history of not having had these problems. There's also evidence that when people stop a psychiatric drug, the process of coming off the drug may precipitate a relapse of something that they have an underlying vulnerability to in the first place. Then, of course, people often get very anxious during the process of coming off psychiatric drugs of different sorts, and that may lead to a relapse or problems. And then, of course, there is the possibility that stopping drugs just reveals the underlying natural history of the condition. But as I said, this really hasn't been appreciated, and loads of relapse prevention trials are published, probably every month, certainly every year, showing this discontinuation effect and completely ignoring it and just saying that this is evidence that people must stay on these drugs. This is evidence that maintenance treatment is a great thing and everyone should have it. This is an example from a relapse prevention trial using esketamine, comparing esketamine to placebo, and showing that if you stop the esketamine, if you stop the placebo esketamine, you relapse very quickly in the first few weeks after you've stopped it. Whereas if you continue with the esketamine, people relapse in a much gentler, more gradual way. And that suggests that there's something about that period after you've just stopped it that is leading to problems and leading to the relapse, or what's perceived to be a relapse. And the same, you can see the same effect in this antipsychotic reduction and discontinuation study, where the black line of people who stop or reduce their antipsychotics relapse much earlier than people who continue on antipsychotics, but in the end, their risk of relapse comes together. And if you follow people up for long enough, there's actually no difference in their relapse rates. It's just that people who came off or withdrew relapsed earlier. So I'm going to skip over that. So I just will finish with a few words about why it is that we might have got it wrong for so long in our thinking about psychiatric drugs. And I think this is because there is a confluence of interests that supports the use of psychiatric drugs and that supports this medical understanding of what they are doing, this idea that they are treating an underlying disease rather than rather than changing our psyche. So the psychiatric profession have used this idea to help bolster the idea that they're proper doctors. And this was particularly important. This has been particularly important from the 1960s onwards, because it was really important at that time, particularly, to distinguish between a doctor who was giving a prescription of a barbiturate or a stimulant from a drug dealer that was selling tablets on the street. And something that I wasn't really aware of until I started looking into this is that the use of recreational drugs really kicks off with the diversion of prescribed drugs. In the 50s and 60s, people are using Purple Hearts. They're using prescribed stimulants and barbiturates on the streets, and it's only later that recreational drug use, the recreational drug users turn to drugs that are manufactured or imported illegally. The pharmaceutical industry, of course, have found this idea that the drugs that they're marketing are treating a disease very useful for bolstering their reputation, and that was particularly important after the crisis about benzodiazepine dependence that happened in the 1980s. It became clear that benzodiazepines had been handed out to all sorts of unhappy people, mostly women, but men too, as a way of keeping them quiet, really. And then they had become addicted and were having real difficulties withdrawing. So the next blockbusters that came along, the SSRI antidepressants, were marketed in a different way. They were marketed by telling people that they had this underlying chemical imbalance and they needed the drug to rectify it. They wanted, the pharmaceutical industry wanted to distance itself from the use of benzodiazepines, which had clearly been chemical pacifiers. And I think you can see how useful that message is as well, with this little quote from a website about antipsychotics. Antipsychotic medicines are believed to work by balancing the chemicals found naturally in the brain, which makes this drug, olanzapine, which makes people put on huge amounts of weight, clearly majorly disrupts the body's metabolic system, among other things, makes it sound as if it is a completely innocuous, almost homeopathic type treatment. And finally, the state. I think the state has also had an investment in supporting this view of drug treatment. And that's because what the drug-centered model is saying is that psychiatric drugs modify people's behavior and therefore people's personality. They don't treat medical illnesses or disease. And when that's done under force, under the Mental Health Act, that's clearly something that is politically highly questionable and needs considerable discussion and scrutiny. And it's much easier to pretend that what we're doing is, when we use the Mental Health Act to force someone to have a drug, it's much easier politically to pretend that people are just having a medical treatment and it will be good for them in the end. And even when people take psychiatric medication voluntarily, I think that there is a question about people's capacity if they have not been properly informed that what this medication is doing is changing their behavior and potentially therefore changing their personality, if we think of personality as patterns of behavior. So that was really most of what I've got to say. I won't go through all this. I just want to emphasize again, psychiatric drugs are toxic substances. They change the normal state of the brain, and we don't fully understand all the changes that they produce and all the implications of those changes. Okay, so I'll stop there and look forward to taking questions in the panel discussion.